Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
talking more about causality, right? I mean, you are a econometrician who transitioned into biostatistics. And as you know, to prove causality, there are two ways, right? There is the standard RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and then you have the quasi-causal methods. Which one have you used more? Historically, what I've seen is that people who are on the econometric side, they rely on quasi-causal methods, and we on
Hmm.
the marketing side also rely on quasi-causal methods because we have only observational data. But on
Hmm.
the epidemiology side or the biostatistics side, I don't think observational data is that common. Maybe it's more experimental in nature. Can you
Hmm.
talk more about this?
Yeah. Um, so in biostatistics, we have a lot of opportunities to do controlled randomized experiments. So that is very, very prevalent. But even in biostatistics, there is this growing desire to use what they call real world evidence. So that is kind of an industry buzzword in pharmaceuticals, because there is so much data that is generated in the real world just by patient interactions in hospitals or with insurers and things like that. And there is these cases where even in biostatistics, even in drug development, you have these edge cases where you cannot perform the randomized trial. So, for example, if you are studying rare diseases and you want to develop a drug, it is unethical for someone that has a rare disease to withhold treatment to them. If because if there is only a limited treatment, you have to give it to them by ethical medical standards.
Mhm.
So if you want to understand the causality of your drug, does it have an effect on the patient that is beneficial? You are forced to control using patients that did not receive the drug, but not as part of a randomized intervention. So you fall into observational data. Not you cannot even like really sometimes design your data collection like we would do in epidemiology. So in epidemiology, what they do is that they use the design of how the data is collected to validate or make plausible certain causal assumptions. So, for example, in epidemiology, they are very keen on doing prospective cohort studies. Why do they do that? Well, they do that because you make sure that the temporality is correct when you choose people in the trial before anything happened and you follow them over time and you monitor, for example, their exposure to cigarette smoking. And over time, you see the ones that were exposed to cigarette smoking, how do they differ to the ones that did not smoke in terms of an outcome, for example, lung cancer rates. So the problem with this is just that it takes a lot of time. It's very expensive, but the causal conclusion is very robust, provided that you understood the mechanism enough to control for all the confounders and things like that. But if you just have a database of people and you look at it retrospectively, well, then there is more complications about the timing, right? Did the cause come before the effect? If that did not happen, then this it is not causal, and things like that. So I think both. I use both in my work, um, but the there is a growing interest in even in fields that traditionally did not do observational data to try to leverage our understanding of observational data. The FDA, for example, is open now to approving drugs based on non-randomized trial data. It's more complicated, but there is this openness, and they are developing guidance and documentation to help companies meet the criteria of the FDA to get drugs approved, or even when you develop a drug, right? You do a trial, even if you do like a huge trial. Let's take the COVID vaccine example. The final trial I think was on tens of thousands of people. So you do a trial, okay, you get very conclusive evidence. The causal effect was very big and it was randomized. Everything was really neat. But then you deploy it to millions of people. And if you have a side effect that is one in a million, you cannot detect it in a trial of even with 10,000 people. So there's also this whole area of biostatistics that is related to what they call pharmacovigilance, where you put a drug on the market, but you still monitor the patients. But now it is not experimental; it is purely observational. So you need
Hmm.
causal inference methods to understand, is this drug causing a rare side effect? So in the COVID case, there was this concern with heart problems like thromboembolism, I think it's called.
Hmm.
That was like a one in a million event, but now you are giving it to millions of people, so you start seeing it. But this is not experimental, so you need causal inference, and it's a very important part of the biostatistics and pharma industry because you need to make sure that you are not harming the patients more than you are benefiting them, right? So there is always this trade-off, and you cannot do that without causal inference. So there is an openness to more and more to understand the power of observational methods in fields like that.
Yeah, is this somehow related to the concept of external validity in causal inference?
Yeah, that is basically like there is this paradox, right, where the more you make a study internally valid, right, the more you take a very precise population with a very defined intervention and things like that, the less it resembles the real world. So you have this paradox where, okay, you have a very defined population, the treatment is highly standardized, it's given in a very strict protocol to the patients. Then you have a high internal validity. But then there is the paradox where, okay, well, what will happen in the real world? Because the treat people will not take the drug every day, they will forget, they might take other drugs with it, and then so you have this trade-off where you cannot get both in one study. You need many studies, many approaches, um, and on the flip side, right? If you do a randomized trial, for example, in A/B testing with online testing, well, if you just expand and expand and expand who you give it to, and you try to get more external validity, well, then you do not understand like how it applies to particular people in a precise way. So you cannot do everything in one study. So you need complementary evidence that from different sides to get both internal and external validity. And there is a very interesting book about causal inference that is not mathematical at all, but it is pretty deep and it is not easy to read. But it's the Shedish, Cook, and Campbell book. Um, and their whole theory of causal inference is about the trade-offs between different validities and how you can use quasi experiments to strengthen different parts of internal external validity. And they have a lot of esteem, and they put a lot of hope in the quasi experimental approach. They are social scientists, so in social science, and I think it's very convincing arguments and very interesting thoughts about how we can design experiment or quasi experiments that are internally valid, some that are more externally valid, and we can use a whole range of studies to understand the phenomenon, not just one.